She walked up to the most dangerous table in all of Manhattan. 12 people. All of them powerful. Some of them ruthless. And she was 24 years old, brand new to the job, hands trembling, heart hammering. She could have smiled, taken their drink orders, and kept her head down. That's what anyone else would have done. But instead, she opened her mouth and said something so unexpected, so deeply personal, that the most feared man in the room slowly took off his sunglasses, looked at her like he was seeing a ghost, and for the first time in 46 years, felt something crack open inside his chest. By the end of that night, this quiet, shy waitress didn't just serve a table. She changed a man's life. She changed her own life. And she left behind a moment so powerful that even the bodyguards standing nearby didn't know whether to look away or hold their breath. If you've never seen a story where a single sentence, spoken in the right language at the right moment, can collapse 50 years of walls around a person's heart, then stay with me because this one is real and it's going to hit you somewhere deep. Welcome to Real Life Echo, the channel where we tell the stories that remind you what it means to be human. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell, because we drop stories like this one every week, and you don't want to miss a single one. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, hit that like button before we're even 5 minutes in. It genuinely helps more people find these stories. Now, let's go back to Manhattan. Let's go back to that restaurant. Let's meet Sophia. The Castellano restaurant on Manhattan's Upper East Side was not the kind of place where ordinary people ate dinner. From the outside, it looked like 1,000 other upscale restaurants in New York. But the moment you stepped inside, you understood immediately that this was different. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings that felt miles above your head. Every table had white linen pressed so perfectly it looked like it had never been touched. The wine list was thicker than most people's mortgage documents. And the clientele on any given evening included hedge fund managers, old money socialites, politicians who needed to be seen in the right places, and occasionally people whose wealth came from sources no one ever discussed openly. That last category was the one that mattered most on this particular Tuesday night. Victor Castellano Senior sat at the best table in the house. It was the corner booth, the one with clear sight lines to every single entrance and exit, the one the restaurant kept permanently reserved, never put on the booking system, never offered to anyone else. At 73 years old, Victor Senior was still the kind of man who commanded a room simply by occupying it. You could feel his presence before you saw him. Something about the air changed when he was nearby. Heavy. Deliberate. Like gravity had quietly doubled. He wore an expensive black suit, but the tattoos crawling up both arms and disappearing beneath his collar told a story the suit was trying to cover. A lion-headed walking cane rested against the booth beside him. Thick gold chain around his neck. Sunglasses on his nose despite being indoors. He was not a man who apologized for who he was. Not to anyone. Not ever. Beside him sat his son, Victor Castellano Jr. Mid-40s. Sharper suit. Fewer tattoos but the same dangerous energy. Victor Jr. ran the family's legitimate business empire, real estate, construction, 3 restaurants including this one. What those businesses covered for was something no one ever spoke about openly. You didn't ask. You didn't point. You simply understood. Tonight was special. Victor Sr. had flown in from Palermo 3 days earlier for his grandson's christening, and tonight was the celebration dinner. The table was set for 12. Family. Close associates. People who mattered in the Castellano world. Roberto, the restaurant's owner, had personally assigned his best servers to that table, and he had been planning the service for a week. Everything had to be perfect. Every detail mattered. This was not a table you got wrong. Which is how 24-year-old Sophia Reyes ended up standing in front of the most dangerous table in Manhattan on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday night. Sophia was the newest waitress at the Castellano restaurant. She'd only been there a few weeks. Small in frame. Quiet by nature. Dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. Wide brown eyes that made her look even younger than 24. She moved through the restaurant the way shy people do, efficiently, professionally, but with a kind of physical apology in her posture, like she was constantly trying to take up as little space as possible. She was the kind of person who smiled when she made eye contact but looked away first. The kind of person who got the order right every time but would never ask a customer to repeat themselves for fear of being a bother. Roberto had pulled her aside before service started that evening. He'd been clear and he'd been serious. Table 9 tonight. The Castellano family. Senior is visiting from Sicily. You be respectful. You be attentive. You do not make eye contact too long. And for the love of God, do not spill anything on anyone at that table. He'd paused then, like he was reconsidering the whole idea. But then he'd continued. I would assign someone more experienced, he told her. But you're the only server I have who's fluent in Italian. Senior doesn't speak much English. I need you there. Sophia had nodded. Told herself she could handle it. Then walked to the back hallway and took 3 very slow, very deep breaths with her hands pressed flat against the cold tile wall. She approached the table for the first time with her hands trembling slightly beneath her notepad. The Castellanos and their guests were already seated. 12 people in expensive clothes, talking in a rapid, fluid mixture of English and Italian that filled the air like music and menace at the same time. Bodyguards were stationed at discreet positions near the entrance. Not obvious enough to alarm the other diners. Obvious enough that anyone paying attention understood exactly what they were looking at. The energy at table 9 was warm among the family itself, the way all family dinners are warm, jokes being told, someone's baby being passed around to admiring hands. But underneath that warmth was a current of something harder, something that made the air feel thick and heavy in a way that had nothing to do with the chandeliers or the wine. Victor Senior noticed Sophia the moment she stepped into his peripheral vision. That was simply what he did. He noticed everything always automatically. His eyes tracked her approach with the careful, practiced assessment of a man who had spent 5 decades reading people instantly, reading situations, reading rooms, and staying alive because of it. Sophia stopped at the edge of the table. She straightened her spine. She took the quietest, most invisible breath of her entire life. And then she did something that nobody at that table saw coming. Not the bodyguards. Not Victor Jr. Not the 12 people who thought they'd seen everything. She bowed her head slightly. And she spoke. Not in standard Italian. Not in the kind of textbook Italian that gets taught in classrooms or heard on television. She spoke in Sicilian dialect. Old country Sicilian. The kind that only comes from specific parts of the island. The kind that sounds less like Italian and more like something older, something rougher, something that belongs to the stone streets and the salt air of a particular place in a particular time that most of the world has forgotten. Buonasera, signore. Benvenuto in New York. She told him it was an honor to have such a distinguished guest in their home. She said her name was Sophia. She told him she would be at his service for the evening. And she said it all with the cadence and the pronunciation of someone who had learned those words not from a teacher but from a grandmother's kitchen table. The table went completely silent. Not the polite, brief silence of a group pausing for a moment. A deep, sudden, total silence. Like someone had turned down the volume on the entire world. Victor Senior slowly reached up and removed his sunglasses. His eyes, sharp and intelligent and dangerous, and something else now too, something that hadn't been there a second ago, fixed on Sophia with an intensity that would have made most people take a step backward without knowing why. He asked her where she learned to speak like that. And Sophia told him the truth. My grandmother was from Palermo, sir. She spoke only in Sicilian dialect in our home. Victor Senior studied her for a long moment. A long, quiet, unblinking moment. And then something happened that people at that table would talk about for years afterward. The hard, guarded expression that had defined Victor Senior's face for decades began to soften. Not completely. This was a man who had spent 50 years in a world where softness was a liability, where the wrong expression at the wrong moment could cost you everything. But the edges smoothed. The jaw unclenched. Something that looked almost like warmth entered his eyes, moving slowly, like light coming through a cracked door. Part of Palermo? He asked. Which part? The Ballarò district, sir. Victor Senior turned to his son. Ballarò, he said quietly. Just that one word. And the way he said it, the weight it carried, the history it held, made several people at the table exchange glances without fully understanding why. Victor Jr. leaned forward. His expression shifted from its usual casual authority into something that looked like genuine interest, genuine curiosity. Your grandmother was from Ballarò? The old neighborhood? Yes, sir. She left Sicily in 1962. Came to New York with nothing. Worked in a garment factory for 30 years. Never went back. Victor Senior spoke again in Sicilian, and this time his voice carried something different in it. Something that made people sit up straighter. Something that felt important in a way that was hard to name but impossible to miss. He told Sophia to sit down. Just for a moment, he said. Sophia looked at him. Then she did the bravest and most natural thing she had done all night. She told him, gently and respectfully, that she had other tables. And she meant no disrespect by it. Roberto materialized so fast it seemed like he had been summoned from thin air. Victor Senior had called his name once. Not loudly. He hadn't needed to be loud. Roberto appeared. Yes, Mr. Castellano Senior? Your waitress, Victor Senior said, is going to sit with us for 5 minutes. Someone else can cover her tables. Roberto looked at Sophia. Then he looked at the man who had just spoken. Then he looked back at Sophia. And he nodded without hesitating for even a full second. Of course, he said. Marco will take over. And just like that, Sophia found herself sitting on a chair that had been pulled up to the most powerful table in the room, her hands folded carefully in her lap, her spine absolutely straight, every instinct she had screaming that this was unusual, that this was outside every protocol she'd been trained for, that she had absolutely no roadmap for what was happening right now. But Victor Senior's expression wasn't threatening. It wasn't dangerous. It was something else entirely, and it took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. My mother was from Ballarò, he said. He switched to English then, heavily accented but clear, perhaps for the benefit of the people at the table who didn't speak Sicilian. She died in 1978. I was 28 years old. She spoke to me in that exact dialect every single day of my life until she was gone. He paused. The restaurant hummed softly around them. Somewhere across the room, a cork was being pulled from a bottle and glasses were being filled and ordinary life was continuing its ordinary rhythm. But at table 9 time had stopped. No one at that table breathed too loudly. No one shifted in their seat. No one reached for their glass. Victor Senior looked at Sophia, and what she saw in his eyes in that moment, she would carry for the rest of her life. No one has spoken to me in that dialect, he said slowly. Not properly. Not the way she did. Not in 46 years. He stopped again. And then, barely above a whisper, he said, You sound exactly like her. The table held its breath. 12 people. Some of the most dangerous and powerful individuals in New York City. Sat absolutely motionless as their patriarch processed a moment that none of them had anticipated and none of them fully understood, but all of them recognized as something real, something rare, something that you don't interrupt and don't rush and don't diminish by speaking when silence is the only appropriate response. Victor Jr. reached across and placed his hand on his father's arm. It was a quiet gesture, gentle and private, the kind that speaks of years of loyalty and love and the specific tenderness that exists between a son and a father who have been through things together that no one else will ever know. Sophia didn't have a script for this moment. She didn't have training that covered it. So she did what her grandmother had always told her to do when the right words weren't available. She spoke from the heart, in the language of home. She told him, in Sicilian, that his mother was a strong woman, like her grandmother. Sicilian mothers, she said. They build everything. They hold everything together. They are the foundation underneath every stone. Victor Senior laughed. A real laugh. Not the polite, controlled, socially appropriate sound of a man in his position performing warmth. A real laugh, surprised out of him, crinkled the corners of his eyes and showed teeth that had smiled at very few people in a very long time. Yes, he said. Yes, they do. He turned to his son and spoke rapidly in Sicilian for a moment, then turned back to Sophia with a different kind of attention in his eyes. Not assessment anymore. Something closer to recognition. He asked her if her grandmother had siblings. Brothers, sisters. One brother, Sophia told him. He stayed in Sicily. My grandmother lost touch with him after she came to America. They tried to write letters for a few years, but they were poor, and the mail was unreliable, and eventually the silence became permanent. Victor Sr. and Jr. exchanged a look. The kind of look that carries information, that communicates something wordlessly between two people who have been communicating without words for decades. Victor Jr. pulled out his phone. He typed something, looked at the screen and turned it toward his father. Whatever the older man read on that screen made his eyebrows rise significantly, slowly, like something was dawning on him that he was still processing. He looked back up at Sophia. Ferrante, he said, repeating her grandmother's maiden name that she'd just shared. From Ballarò. Yes, sir. I knew a Ferrante family in Ballarò. When I was young. He paused. Chose his next words with deliberate care. They were good people, he said. Honest people. They had a daughter who went to America in the early 60s. Sophia's breath caught in her chest like a stone lodged behind her ribs. My grandmother's name was Lucia Ferrante. Victor Sr. closed his eyes. Just for a second. Just briefly. When he opened them, the last of the hardness was gone. What remained was something raw and unguarded and genuine, the emotion of a man who had spent so many decades surrounded by people who feared him, and by the weight of who he'd become, suddenly confronted, without warning, without preparation, with a thread that ran all the way back to the world that existed before any of that. Lucia, he said softly. I remember Lucia. She used to sing in the square on Sunday evenings. She had a beautiful voice. You could hear it from 2 streets away and it never sounded like showing off. It just sounded like the neighborhood breathing. Sophia's eyes filled. She couldn't stop it. She didn't try. She sang to me every night, she told him. Every night until she died. Last year. The table held its collective breath. Victor Senior reached across and took Sophia's hand in both of his. His tattooed fingers, fingers that had done things no one at that table would ever speak aloud, held her hand with a gentleness so complete it seemed impossible that those same hands were capable of anything else. "I am sorry for your loss, Sophia. Lucia Ferrante was a good woman. I remember her kindness when I was a boy, when my family had nothing. Nothing at all. The Ferrantes, they shared what little they had with everyone in the neighborhood. People who had less than they did and people who had more. It didn't matter to them. Kindness wasn't conditional in that family." He released her hand and sat back. His expression went somewhere private and distant for a moment, somewhere 60 years away, somewhere in a small square in Palermo where a girl was singing on a Sunday evening and a boy was standing on a corner listening without letting on that he was listening. Then he turned to Victor Jr. and spoke in rapid Sicilian for nearly a full minute. His son listened. Nodded several times. Listened some more. Then turned back to Sophia. "My father would like to make an offer," Victor Jr. said. Not as a business proposition. His words were deliberate. As family honors family. Even when the family connection is distant and old. Sophia shook her head before he could continue. "I don't need anything, sir. I'm just grateful. Your father's memories of my grandmother. This conversation. That means more than you know. More than anything else you could offer." Victor Jr. smiled. "He says he anticipated you'd say that exactly. He says the offer isn't charity. It's recognition." And then he asked her, "You're studying to be a nurse, correct?" Sophia blinked. "How did you know that?" "Roberto mentioned it when they discussed staffing," Victor Jr. told her. "You work here nights. You study during the day. You support yourself completely, entirely alone. My father wants to cover your remaining tuition. All of it. Not as a gift. As payment for the greatest thing you gave him tonight." Sophia opened her mouth. "I can't," she started. Victor Sr. held up one finger. Just one finger. Quiet, unhurried, absolute. And Sophia stopped speaking. Not because she was afraid. But because there was a quality to that gesture, a calm, immovable authority, that made every word she'd been about to say feel like it could wait. "Sophia," he said. "My mother would want me to help a Ferrante girl become a nurse. She would never forgive me if I didn't." His accent thickened with the emotion pushing up through his chest. "You honor her memory by speaking our language. Let me honor your grandmother's memory by helping you finish your education." He looked at her steadily. "This," he said, "is not negotiable." Sophia looked around the table. At the powerful, complicated, layered people watching this exchange. At Victor Jr., who was smiling warmly. At the bodyguards near the door, who had somehow relaxed, somewhere in the last 20 minutes, from their usual vigilance into something that looked almost human. Almost amused. Almost moved. She looked back at Victor Sr. "Thank you, Signore," she whispered. "Grazie mille." Victor Sr. nodded once. A single firm nod. Then he put his sunglasses back on. Picked up his menu. His voice returned to its commanding, no-nonsense tone. "Now," he said in English. "I believe we ordered appetizers 40 minutes ago. Where is my food?" The table erupted in laughter. Real, warm, sudden laughter, the kind that only happens when tension releases all at once and becomes joy instead. And just like that, dinner began. Sophia finished that evening in a kind of daze. She moved through the rest of her shift with the same professional efficiency she always had, but something had shifted inside her, something fundamental and quiet, like tectonic plates that don't announce themselves. Roberto pulled her aside at the end of service. His expression was somewhere between hilarity and complete disbelief. "What did you do?" he asked her. "I greeted him in Sicilian," she said. "That's all. That's all." Roberto repeated it like he was trying to understand a foreign language. He shook his head slowly. "Do you know who Victor Castellano Senior is?" "I have some idea," she said. "And you walked up to that table and made him cry in front of his entire inner circle by speaking like his dead mother." "Sophia, I have been running this restaurant for 20 years. I have never, not once, seen anyone affect that man the way you affected him tonight. Not his wife. Not his children." A 24-year-old waitress on her third week of work walked up to the most dangerous table in Manhattan and made the man sitting at the center of it feel something he hadn't felt in nearly half a century. Roberto looked at her with something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Something like reverence. "I didn't mean to make him feel anything," Sophia said quietly. "I just wanted to be respectful." Roberto nodded slowly. "And that," he said, "is exactly why it worked." 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived at the restaurant addressed to Sophia. Her name was written in careful, old-fashioned handwriting on the front. Inside was a cashier's check. It covered her entire remaining nursing school tuition. Every dollar. Not partial. Not a contribution. All of it. There was no note inside the envelope. No signature. No explanation. Just the check. And a single photograph. Black and white. Slightly faded at the edges. A young girl standing in the center of a Sicilian square, her mouth open, singing, surrounded by a cluster of neighbors who had stopped whatever they were doing to listen. On the back of the photograph, written in shaky, careful handwriting, Lucia Ferrante. Ballarò. 1960. Per Sophia. Sophia sat alone at a table in the empty restaurant after her shift ended that night, holding that photograph with both hands. And she wept. Not the polite, contained kind of crying that you do when you're trying to keep yourself together in public. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and old, the kind that doesn't care how it looks, the kind that is less about sadness and more about being seen. She wept because her grandmother had been a real person in a real place with a real life before Sophia's world existed. And that life had mattered, had been witnessed, had been carried in the memory of another human being for 60 years. She wept because the woman she had loved most in the world, who had sung her to sleep every single night of her childhood, who had pressed Sicilian dialect into her ears like a gift she didn't know she was receiving, had left a trace in the world that had survived her. And that trace had found Sophia, in a Manhattan restaurant, on an ordinary Tuesday night, through the most unlikely chain of coincidences and connections and moments of simple human recognition. The money would change her life. She knew that. It would remove the crushing financial weight that had been slowly grinding her down, the weight of tuition bills and night shifts and the constant arithmetic of survival that plays in the background of every thought when you are young and poor and doing it entirely alone. But the photograph was something else entirely. The photograph was proof that her grandmother's life had been beautiful before it was hard. Had been joyful before it was work. Had filled a square with music that a boy on a corner had never forgotten. She finished nursing school 8 months later. She specialized in geriatric care. She chose that specialty deliberately and specifically, working with elderly patients, many of them immigrants, people whose families had crossed oceans and built entire lives from nothing but the willingness to keep going. She brought her Sicilian dialect into her work. She spoke to patients in their home language whenever she could, patient by patient, whatever fragment of heritage she could reach toward. She understood, in a way that can only be understood by someone who has lived it, that for people who are far from the place they were born, hearing their mother tongue is not a comfort. It is medicine. It is something no prescription can replicate and no procedure can substitute. She had learned that from a corner booth in a Manhattan restaurant. She had learned it from a man who had gone 46 years without hearing the sound of home and who had wept when he finally did. Victor Senior visited the Castellano restaurant one more time before leaving New York to return to Sicily permanently. He asked for Sophia specifically, and she served his table with the same quiet grace she had shown that very first night. At the end of the meal, near closing, when the restaurant had emptied and the chandeliers seemed dimmer and the white linen looked softer in the low light, he called her over one last time. He sat back in his corner booth with his cane beside him and his gold chain catching the light and his sunglasses hanging from his breast pocket for once, and he looked at Sophia the way very old people sometimes look at very young people when they want to say something that matters. Sophia, he said, when you finish your nursing, come to Palermo. Visit Ballarò. Find the square where Lucia used to sing. It's still there. Everything changes and that square stays the same. Stand there. Stand in the center of it. And sing something. Anything. It doesn't matter what. What? She asked him. He smiled. Because the neighborhood remembers, he said. The stones remember. And Lucia's spirit will hear her granddaughter's voice in the place where she first learned to sing. He held her gaze for a long moment, steady and serious and kind. And then he said, come back to New York and take care of old men like me. We need nurses who speak our language. Yes, signore, she told him. I promise. Years passed. Sophia kept that promise. She stood in that square. She found it exactly as he had described it, small and worn and surrounded by ancient buildings the color of old honey in the late afternoon sun. She arrived at sunset deliberately because it seemed like the right time, the golden hour, the time when light softens everything and the edges of the world go warm. She walked to the center of the square and stood there for a moment, just standing, feeling the stones beneath her feet. Around her, ordinary life moved at its ordinary pace. Old men at an outdoor table. A woman hanging laundry from a high window. Children running somewhere out of sight. Nobody paid attention to the young woman standing in the center of the square. And then she sang. She sang the lullaby her grandmother had sung to her every night of her childhood. The one she had fallen asleep to so many hundreds of times that the melody lived in her body the way breathing does, automatic and fundamental and inseparable from being alive. She sang it softly, not performing, not announcing, just offering it to the air and the stones and whatever remained of the people who had once lived and loved and worked and sang in this exact spot 60 years before. Nobody seemed to notice. The old men at their table didn't look up. The woman with the laundry didn't pause. Life continued as it does, indifferent to the private sacred moments that happen inside it. But the air felt warmer. The stones felt less cold. And somewhere in whatever place good memories go when the people who hold them are gone, somewhere in the archive of human love and loss and connection, something recognized that song. Something that had been waiting heard the melody it had taught. And a woman named Lucia, who had left this square in 1962 and crossed an ocean and worked 30 years in a factory and sung her granddaughter to sleep every night until she was gone, was present in that moment in every way that mattered. This is the part of the story that's hardest to talk about. Not the money. Not the coincidence. Not even the beautiful symmetry of it, the girl in the square singing the same song 60 years apart. The hardest part to articulate is what the whole thing means. Because what actually happened at that restaurant on that Tuesday night was simpler and more profound than any of the surface details. A young woman was genuine. That's it. That's the whole thing at the center of all of it. Sophia didn't perform confidence she didn't have. She didn't calculate the right move or strategize for advantage. She was tired and nervous and she had trembling hands and she walked up to the most intimidating table of her life and she was simply, completely, authentically herself. She brought the thing she carried, her grandmother's language, her grandmother's cadence, her grandmother's way of speaking with warmth towards strangers, and she offered it without expecting anything back. And that authenticity, that complete absence of performance or strategy, walked straight through every wall that 50 years of power and protection had built around Victor Castellano Senior and touched something that nobody had been able to reach for nearly half a century. Because here is the truth about people who have lived hard lives behind hard faces. They are not harder inside. They are often softer, more carefully, more protectively soft, than the people who never needed to build walls in the first place. The walls are not the person. The walls are the survival strategy. And when something genuine reaches past the walls, when the real language comes through, when the home sound arrives without warning or agenda, what happens is not unusual. What happens is just a human being reminded that they are a human being. That they were a child once. That someone sang to them. That they were loved before the world taught them to be something else. That is what Sophia gave Victor Senior. Not pity. Not respect earned through fear. Not professional courtesy. She gave him his mother for 5 minutes. She gave him the sound of home in a language he had forgotten he was still waiting to hear. And for a man who had lived as long and as hard as he had lived, that was the most valuable thing in the world. It cannot be bought or negotiated or arranged. It can only be given. And she gave it freely. There's something in this story worth sitting with. Something beyond the surface narrative. How many people are walking around right now carrying something extraordinary inside them? A language, a skill, a perspective, a piece of cultural knowledge that has been passed down to them across generations and oceans and decades of sacrifice, and they have minimized it. How many people have been in situations where they dimmed that thing, apologized for it, tucked it away so as not to seem unusual or difficult or too much? How many moments like Sophia's almost didn't happen because the person carrying the gift decided it wasn't appropriate to offer? The stories we inherit from the people who raised us are not footnotes. They are not background noise. They are the most precise and irreplaceable things we carry. Sophia's grandmother pressed a dialect into her ears every day of her childhood, not because she thought it would change anything, not because she had any plan for what it might someday mean, but simply because it was hers and she wanted her granddaughter to have it too. That gift, given without agenda, received without fully understanding its value, changed Sophia's life on an ordinary Tuesday night in Manhattan 20-some years later. Your grandmother's words are in you somewhere right now. Your grandfather's songs. Your mother's phrases. The particular way someone who loved you described the world in a language that most of the world doesn't speak. Those things are not relics. They are not quaint. They are not things to be embarrassed about in rooms full of people who didn't have them. They are medicine. They are connection. They are the thing that can walk into any room, even the most intimidating one, even the one full of people with power and history and walls built thick and tall, and find the human being inside. Sophia knew that because her grandmother taught her. And her grandmother knew it because her mother taught her. And her mother knew it because she came from a square in Palermo where singing on Sunday evenings was simply what people did. That's the line. That unbroken line from a girl singing in a square in 1960 to a woman singing in that same square decades later. That line goes through a garment factory in New York. It goes through 30 years of hard work in small apartments and letters that stopped coming. It goes through a kitchen table where a grandmother taught a grandchild words in a language the rest of the world wasn't interested in. It goes through nursing school and night shifts and trembling hands in a fine dining restaurant. And it ends in a Palermo sunset with a lullaby rising from the center of a square that has been standing there long before any of the people in this story were born and will be standing there long after all of them are gone. That is what heritage is. That is what inheritance is. Not property. Not money. Not the things you can hold. The things that hold you. The language of home. The song that someone sang in the beginning of a life that eventually became the foundation of yours. Now before we wrap up, I want to ask you something directly. And I'm asking because this community, this real-life echo community, is built on exactly this. What's a word in your family's language that makes you feel like you're home? It doesn't have to be a big word. It doesn't have to mean anything that translates well. It might be a pet name someone called you. It might be a phrase your grandmother used when she was trying to comfort you. It might be a word so specific to your family's region or village that autocorrect doesn't even know what to do with it. Those words are treasures. They are more valuable than they look from the outside. Drop it in the comments right now. Tell us the word. Tell us what it means. Tell us who taught it to you. Because that's what this channel is for. Not just to tell you stories. To create a space where the things that normally stay private and quiet and tucked away can come out into the open and be recognized as the extraordinary things they are. Every comment you leave connects you to someone else who is carrying something similar. Every word you share keeps something alive that deserves to be kept alive. If this story moved you even a little, share it with someone right now. Think about who in your life needs to hear this story today. Maybe someone who is carrying their heritage quietly and doesn't realize what a gift it is. Maybe someone who is far from home and needs to be reminded that home travels with you. Maybe someone who is working hard in a difficult situation and needs to hear that the thing that feels small and private and ordinary about who they are might be the most extraordinary thing in the room. Send it to them. Not later. Right now. Because stories like this one only do what they're meant to do when they reach the people who need them. And you already know exactly who that person is. And if you're new to Real Life Echo, welcome. This is what we do here. Every week we find the moments that remind us what it means to be human. The ones that happen not in boardrooms or headlines but at restaurant tables and kitchen tables and town squares at sunset. The ones where an ordinary person does one ordinary thing, and it turns out to be the most important thing. Subscribe. Stay with us. There are so many more stories where this one came from. And the next one might be exactly what someone you love needs to hear. This is Real Life Echo. We'll see you in the next story.